Hello, welcome to the latest edition of MHP Group's In Conversation With. I'm Charlotte Grant, Associate Director here. Before joining MHP, I was a reporting presenter at ITN, which is where I met and worked with our guest today, Nick Wallis, who we're thrilled to have join us. Nick is one of the leading experts on the Post Office Horizon scandal. He spent more than a decade investigating it, reporting on it for ITN, as well as 2 BBC Panorama programmes and a 10-part series for BBC Radio 4, as well as writing a book on it, The Great Post Office Scandal. He was also the only journalist to cover the Johnny Depp and Amber Heard trials, both in the UK and in America. So we're looking forward to hearing his insights ahead of his new book, Depp V Heard, The Unreal Story, which was out on the 17th of May. We're going to be discussing both scandals this morning with MHP's Head of Crisis and Risk, Barnaby Fry. With Barnaby's 2 decades as a financial and corporate communications specialist, we're in an excellent position when it comes to examining how companies respond to an issue and where crisis communications can fall down. First of all, I should say, if you have a question, to put it into the chat, as we'll be taking questions towards the end of the session. But first, let's begin with the Post Office scandal. If I can summarise then, it is regarded as one of the biggest miscarriages of justice in recent legal history. Over 14 years, the Post Office prosecuted more than 700 sub-postmasters and mistresses for theft, fraud and false accounting in their branches. But they hadn't done anything wrong. Thanks to the work of Nick and other journalists, we now know the fault was with the computer system called Horizon. That some people went to prison, some died before their convictions were overturned or before they received compensation. An inquiry is still ongoing to establish a clear account of the failings of the Horizon IT system. So just tell us, first of all, Nick, when did you first hear about it and what drove you to start investigating it?
So I used to keep a keen eye on the Twitter feed during the breakfast show. And one day a tweet popped up from an organisation called Surrey Cars asking if they could bid for the BBC Surrey taxi account, which made me laugh because anyone who works in local radio will know that there's, the idea that we'd have money to spend on taxis is ludicrous. And had we had a taxi account, I would have forwarded the tweet to management and thought no more about it. But because we didn't, I said something flippant like, oh, it depends whether your drivers will come on air and tell us their great stories. And the response I got was, oh, I've got a story, all right, call me after the show. So we swapped numbers privately, and then after the show had finished, I gave Surrey Cars a call. And Surrey Cars turned out to be a single person called Devinder Misra, who over the course of 40 minutes told me how his pregnant wife, the former sub-postmistress at West Byfleet Post Office, had been sent to prison for a crime she didn't commit, which, given the standard of stories that you normally get in BBC local radio, was something of an eye-opener. So I went to see him. I was lucky in that the story was already in the public domain. In 2009, Computer Weekly had done a seminal investigation, which didn't involve the Misras, but involved several other sub-postmasters who said that they'd been convicted of crimes which they didn't commit, and it was down to the Post Office Horizon IT system throwing up faulty figures. And I think within about half an hour of talking to Devinder on the phone, I was talking to the head of the Justice for Sub-Postmasters Alliance, a campaign group run by a chap called Alan Bates. So in many ways, the story was there. It fell into my lap. It was already in the public domain. But what I was able to do in my position as a BBC, well, not staffer, but essentially a full-time contractor, was push this story internally and get it turned into a television investigation, which really piqued my interest in this story because the response to that single piece of broadcast television on regional BBC One was to receive many more emails from other sub-postmasters who said they too had been prosecuted and convicted through the criminal courts, again for crimes that they didn't commit. So that was my introduction to the story, and I resolved to keep pushing it any way I could. I managed to make contact with Private Eye, and after a bit of back and forth, I sent them all the documents that I had, and Richard Brooks wrote the first article in November 2011. That was the first of the many articles that Private Eye have written over the years, and we ended up collaborating on a 6-page special back in 2020. And I also pushed it up the BBC chain, got it onto the One Show, and eventually got it onto Panorama in 2015.
And we touched upon, I think, when my computer quit, apologies for that, as I was saying, we touched upon there have been some revelations now over the weekend and today as well in terms of the accounts. So we know that the chief executive of the Post Office, Nick Reed, is going to return part of his £450,000 bonus for last year. Just explain the significance of this latest twist, I suppose.
Yeah, what we know is that the Post Office, which has filed its annual accounts, and when I say annual accounts and annual report, I mean the same thing, the document that every large corporation submits to Companies House once a year. The Post Office has submitted its annual report late for the last 2 years. It submitted the 2021 to 2022 accounts in late February this year. And a diligent lawyer for the Post Office Horizon IT inquiry was just reading through it and happened to notice that not only had the Post Office set up a bonus metric for its senior leadership and executives, so around 50 people at the top of the organization, relating to its work to the public inquiry, but it also said that the bonus metric had been achieved and signed off by Sir Wyn Williams and his team. So Wyn Williams is the retired judge who is the independent chair of the Post Office Horizon IT inquiry. And the lawyer who was reading this took one look at it and thought, there's something not quite right here. We have no recollection of this. So the lawyer wrote to the Post Office's lawyers, Herbert Smith Freehills, and said, could you just explain how you came to make the assertion that the independent chair of the inquiry has not only submitted your accounts, but knows anything about them? The inquiry had not been informed by the Post Office that it was choosing as one of its bonus metrics the way it cooperated with the inquiry. Now, journalistically, this is huge because we have known now for a number of months that the Post Office is doing everything it can to minimize the amount of compensation it hands over to the wrong sub-postmasters whose lives it ruined. The very fact that the Post Office should be choosing to remunerate, or as one legal watcher said, monetize its involvement in the inquiry, at the very least should be raising eyebrows. I mean, this is something that the Post Office had to be dragged kicking and screaming to court in order to come clean about what it had been doing over the last 20 years. And now it's choosing, its board, its remuneration committee has signed off a bonus scheme which will monetize their approach to the inquiry. And the metric for how that bonus is achieved is so woolly as to be meaningless. And it is false. The line in the actual annual report is a simple sentence, and every single word of it is untrue. Now, an annual report, as I'm sure many of the people watching this seminar know, is a very, very important document. It is laid before Companies House. It is signed off by the top legal team. It is signed by the chairman, chief executive, and chief financial officer. Because the Post Office is a government-owned company, it is laid before Parliament. The Post Office has therefore misled Parliament, and it recognised this on the 6th of April this year when it wrote to the inquiry saying, not quite sure how this happened. We're still trying to find out. It was the Group Chief People Officer who recommended that this be signed off, and she's left the organisation, so we're still sort of looking into this. That was the 6th of April that the inquiry got that letter from the Post Office. On Friday afternoon, the day before the coronation, when the news agenda was filled with news of the local election results, the Post Office quietly slipped out a correction to its annual accounts with the apology, with the notice that the chief executive would be handing back part of his bonus, and an indication that a correction would be put in the next year's annual accounts. We may not have even noticed this. I don't know about you. Most journalists, Charlotte, I don't know what it was like when you were working on this side of the fence. Annual reports are a great source of news, and diligent journalists should be, studying them, especially if it's their area of expertise. I was trying to finish a book on Johnny Depp at the time the annual report came out, so I missed this at the time. But also, I wasn't watching the Post Office corporate website for an update to its web pages on Friday afternoon. It was only because the inquiry took the step of publishing the letter of apology from the chief executive, the personal letter of apology to Sir Wyn Williams, at 19 minutes to 6 on Friday afternoon that we got any wind of this at all. So I saw this email, and I was, as everyone probably was, just powering down for the weekend, thinking about what I was going to have for dinner and how much of the coronation I was going to get to watch. And read this email, read the link, read the documents in the link, started tweeting, stopped myself because I couldn't quite believe what I'd read. And I thought, am I about to make a terrible mistake? Surely it can't be this bad. Went back and read the documents again and thought, no, it really is this bad. The Post Office has essentially misled Parliament. It's really annoyed the Post Office Horizon IT inquiry. It's published a falsehood, and it has tried to create a bonus scheme around its relationship with the statutory inquiry going forward. So I tweeted that out, and it got quite a bit of traction over the weekend. I had a chat with the PR person from the press office over the weekend. Everything was flying back and forth. Some of the big hitting columnists got involved, like Dan Needle, who brought down Nadeem Zahawi. The Times have written it up, the FT have written it up. And the latest development, which happened overnight, is that the chair of the select committee, the business select committee, has now decided that he's going to hold an evidence session whereby I suspect the chief executive of the Post Office will be carpeted before Parliament to explain how he came to agree to a bonus scheme which monetised their efforts involved with the inquiry, how the Post Office came to print a falsehood and mislead Parliament in its annual accounts, and how it only came to get round to telling anyone on a Friday afternoon before the coronation. So that's your latest.
Barnaby, I don't know where to begin really with that. I mean, maybe if we focus initially on the timing, what do you make from your perspective in terms of the timing?
I mean, we talk to clients all the time about, of course, there's regulatory requirements to publish your annual reports. Of course, you'll be, working to a timetable, etc. But you need to look at the context, and context is absolutely key for situations like this. What we talk to our clients about is look around you, look at what the optics of what you're choosing to do. If releasing on a Friday is we would always say don't release on a Friday afternoon anyway, or don't release on a Friday. It looks like you're trying to bury something, and particularly if there are major events on, like a coronation or an election, you want to make sure that you are being transparent and open in order to show that you are taking this seriously and you are dealing with a situation. We don't know the circumstances of what led the Post Office there, but you should be looking at the context when you release these things.
And Nick, you mentioned that you'd been speaking to the press officer from the Post Office over the weekend. Like, how would you describe, I suppose, as you kept digging away at the story, what were your interactions like with the press office? What was their behaviour?
They've always been exceptionally civil to me, even when they were in their what I call their batshit cover-up denial phase. The relationship that I've had with the Post Office press team, I have kept civil because it's essential for me to be able to do my job properly, that I can get information that I need, and that they don't think of me as someone who is going to twist their words or do anything untoward when it comes to what they are telling me. However, the Post Office has essentially lied so many times, and I think the Metropolitan Police are coming up against this now. They have lied so many times and been caught lying on the record that it becomes very, very difficult to believe what they are feeding you is anything more than a line, rather than the facts. I had a conversation with the press officer on Saturday because I wanted to get to the bottom of the timing of the release of the information, why they'd sat on it since the 6th of April. I mean, on Saturday, I discovered the minister was not informed. The minister, who is the Postal Affairs Minister, was not informed of this falsehood in their annual accounts until after the Post Office had published it on the Friday afternoon. So I was dealing with the sort of fallout from that. But I also had the conversation, why this Friday? Why have you done it this Friday? And the press officer swore blind that it had absolutely nothing to do with the news agenda. And I said, well, why did you pick that day then? Have you finally got to the bottom of how this happened? They said, oh, no, we haven't yet. I said, well, why were you sitting on it from the 6th of April until Friday? And they said, well, it just, we were just getting the wording of the apology right. And I said, well, I'm sorry, I just don't believe you. And I printed that. I printed that in my blog post. I said, this is what the Post Office say. And I politely informed them that I didn't believe them. And there's been some back and forth that I've had with the press officers subsequent to that, because she feels that I'm impugning her integrity. And I said, well, until I've seen any documentary evidence that proves that this wasn't a timing issue. But that's, I mean, this is an organization that is now mired itself in yet another scandal, whilst trying to get, whilst still trying to show the world a clean pair of heels about what it's been doing for the last 20 years. And it's a perception thing. They think they are a good organization. They think they are doing the right thing. Unfortunately, from the outside, it looks like they do not give two hoots about the victims of this scandal. They do not give two hoots about accountability. And all they care about is their reputation. And this is, I would say, a big learning for any corporate organization involved in any crisis, no matter how big or small. People who are giving the leadership advice have their own reasons for giving that advice. And it may be because you're their superior, or it may be because they want to protect their own position, or they may be thinking in a slightly panicked way about protecting the reputation of the organization. So the quality of the information that you're getting is not necessarily the information you need on which to make decisions. And I think the Post Office is so divorced from reality. I mean, even a High Court judge called them the Flat Earth Society. It's so divorced from reality. It thinks it is doing the right thing, and it is not taking enough advice from outside the organization, who well, plenty of critics are willing to line up and say what they're doing, but that then becomes an issue with the organization going, oh, well, they would say that because they're against us. I would say you need friendly voices, whether it's done structurally by getting focus groups in who have no side to what they're saying, will tell you like it is, or just someone you trust who is utterly divorced from your organization and has no skin in the game, who you trust for confidential, wise counsel, and say, what is happening? What does this look like to the average person? Because the position that the Post Office has managed to get itself in over this bonus scheme and its utter failure to recognize that it had put a blatant falsehood in its annual report is largely, I think, down to its failure to recognize how other people perceive the organization. They think they're the good guys.
And Barney, I imagine that sort of difference between internal perspective versus an external perspective is so important in these sorts of situations.
Yeah, it's really vital. And I think so often in a crisis, as Nick said, corporates look at, what can I say to minimize the attention on me, or what can I say that just allows me to try and explain what I've done, but does so without any empathy for the people that have been impacted by the crisis. And we see that time and time again, where a very bland, impenetrable defense is given, when actually just some empathy for those that were impacted would go a long way, and clear commitments to do something about it. And then not sort of layering on top of that by then, saying those commitments, not adhering to those commitments, or actually doing something else, which clearly, potentially in this case, there's been further actions that have gone on top of the original action. So, for us, it's all about look to the outside. As Nick said, great idea. Go and get some research. Go and understand what's going on. We've done crises in the past where we want those consumers, those people on the street, those customers to tell us what they feel about an issue, to allow us to then make sure that we're proportionally responding to it. So absolutely, you should look at the context.
And Nick, kudos to you for sort of investigating it for so many years. Are there any points where you think if the Post Office had acted differently, things might have turned out differently?
The Post Office is an extraordinary beast in that it is one of those arm's length organisations wholly owned by the government. Now, you do rely on an active shareholder base to keep your board of directors in check, whereas the government made it its business to keep the Post Office at arm's length. So it wasn't providing proper governance to it in the way that you would expect in a normal corporate environment. You also had a supine union called the National Federation of Sub-Postmasters, which was fatally compromised by its belief in the Horizon system being the brave new world for its members, and wouldn't countenance any criticism of it. So it had no scrutiny from underneath. What the Post Office desperately needed was this external perspective. And unfortunately, because it was such a desperately backward-looking and inept branch of essentially the civil service, the new executives that were being brought in to try and change the culture were just simply being ignored. And when the Post Office realized it had an existential crisis on its hands, i.e. its central IT system, which sat on the countertop of every single branch in the country, was potentially unreliable, it decided that it had to cover it up. And in order to be able to do that effectively, it had to culturally convince everyone in the organization that the campaigners and MPs who were saying there was a problem with this system were fundamentally wrong, weren't in full possession of the facts, or trying it on. And they managed to successfully do that within the company culture, which allowed them to front this out for such a long period of time. But ultimately, it failed catastrophically, and they're dealing with the fallout now. So in terms of what the Post Office could have done, I came to them with questions. I said, look, here are some people whose lives have been ruined. I don't know what the truth of this situation is, but I've read their documentation. These are people who've lived blameless lives up until the point that they got a post office. There seem to be dozens of them around the country. I mean, this was before we knew it went into the thousands. There seem to be dozens of them around the country, all telling the same story. What do you have to say for yourself? And the Post Office's response was to send messages and call up editors of people like me, my bosses, and many other journalist bosses, and say, you're barking up the wrong tree here. You're going to embarrass yourself. There's absolutely no evidence there's anything wrong with the IT system. I really, really think you ought to just think twice before you put out a story claiming something which you have no evidence for. And you could say to a degree that was a very effective strategy, because it did cow some less convinced editors who didn't have the faith in their journalists to not necessarily run stories, which is why this scandal remained hidden for so long. But I mean, you know, the Post Office is in an unusual position because of the proximity it has to state power, because it had its own prosecutors and the like. But the advice it was getting at the very highest level cannot have been right. And I would always say to any large corporate or any small corporate, if you are in a crisis, yes, you must get legal advice from a trusted general counsel or someone who can tell you whether or not, on the facts that you are looking at right now, the law may have been broken. Because obviously, if you are having to deal with a situation where something unlawful may have happened, you need to be cognizant of that and understand the limits within which you're operating before you make any kind of decision. But I would also say, do not take the advice of the lawyers as your leadership strategy, because lawyers will always advise the safest possible option within the confines of the law. They are not there to think about brand awareness or the way that you will be perceived publicly. They want to control information, because they're constantly thinking about what might happen if this turns into a litigation, and they're thinking about how this is going to sound in a court of law. They are not thinking about the way that the public and customers and potential victims of whatever has gone wrong are thinking right now. So you need to take that advice and understand that as the parameters within which you can make your decisions. But then you need to show leadership. And leadership is so different from management. It can mean taking decisions which are not only potentially or look short-term bad for you and your career or your organization, but if you are convinced it is the morally right thing to do, then you can defend that position for as long as the crisis lasts.
Barnaby, does it come down to the word transparency again?
It does. I mean, I think Nick's put it really eloquently. I mean, legal action is one of the levers you can pull, but you've got to make a decision as to when you're going to pull that, if you're going to pull that, and if it actually befits the situation you're in. The other thing I'd say is, you know, he's right. It could have been different for businesses that look at a crisis and say, you know what, I'm going to do the right thing here. I'm going to investigate. I'm going to work with the journalist. I'm going to look into it. I'm going to give them, you know, transparency over the actions I'm going to take. And particularly where you've got something which is, you know, is happening time and time again, to then take legal action might not be the right action to take at all. Actually, by working with the victims, looking at, you know, working with the with the media or detractors. You're working with the activists and trying to find a solution, trying to find out why it's happening. Making a commitment to make a change is much more powerful with a level of transparency. You may not be able to give everything away, but you will be able to take people with you and talk about how you're making real structural change. The other point I make is this is as much internal as it is external. So these are employees that you need to look at. Often in a crisis situation, it's an outward looking media first led response. In actual fact, you need to think about all of your stakeholders and how you're going to explain to them those commitments you're making and how you're fixing the problem.
And could I just add one more thing to that? If you are faced with an existential crisis, i.e. you are dealing with something which, if it turns out to be true or slightly true, has the potential to actually end your organization, then you need to start asking yourself personal questions. You need to start saying, okay, if this organization fails and it's on my watch because something really bad has happened, you need to start thinking about your own moral, personal accountability, not just to the organization that you work for, but to society. And that's when you start possibly having to wrestle with some very, very difficult questions, because there will be people with money invested in your business who are saying, we're not going to let this business fail. So that's when, and I'd love to have been a fly on the wall in some of the corporate discussions that were had at the post office and other organizations that were going down the Swanee, any high profile failure of the last few years, because when you are in what one barrister who was in the army described me as a position of total war, when you are dug in because you have an existential threat, that's when you start making catastrophically bad decisions in order to save the entirety of the organization. And the post office found itself in that environment to the extent that it even went as far as trying to remove a high court judge from a litigation because it didn't like one of the judgments he'd written. And that is when you reveal yourselves to be rotten to the core and you have not helped society in any way. So that there comes a point at which you might look at a scandal and go, I don't think there's any way back from this. And if you think there's a way back from this, that's fine, but I'm out. I'm standing down from this. Or you find a way of saying, look, the only way to save our organization now is to come completely clean, take the long-term hit and rebuild.
Yeah, and that's really because we often talk to clients about causing a crisis to end a crisis, right? And actually the proactive option, being transparent, getting out there, getting out in front of it, and again outlining how you're going to try and fix it, even if it is a really critical threat, still could mean that the organization could continue if that if people perceive that what you're doing is impactful enough. But causing your own crisis, absolutely a strategy that corporates should think about in those difficult situations.
Actually, sorry, Charlotte.
Go for it. No, go for it.
Just one final point on that. One thing that the post office didn't do, and they still haven't done, is give me an interview. I've never interviewed a chief executive of the post office. Now, Paula Venables, when this scandal broke in 2013, did issue a press release about some efforts that they were taking to try and investigate this properly. But a proper leader stands out in front of the media, having got a full understanding of what the situation is, what they're going to do next to make it better, and tell as many people who want to listen that whatever happens, they're investigating, they take it seriously, and they're going to fix this and they're going to make it right. Now, the post office didn't do that. And I think actually long term, anyone looking back on that strategy would agree that it's been a mistake. Now, you could say they were trying to defend the indefensible and they already knew that. So they were just trying to keep quiet in the hope it went away. But again, it's a sign of trust and honesty with your customers, with your shareholders, with the body politic, with politicians, that whatever is going on, your leadership has to own that, and they have to do so publicly.
And Nick, you mentioned the tactic before about them calling you up to try and talk the story down, basically. Do you think how effective do you think that was as a strategy? Did it actually work, or did it compel you to think, oh, there must be something here for me to investigate?
Well, I know for a fact that the post office's strategy did have a chilling effect on the reporting of the scandal. And to be fair, if you listen to them, and you should always listen to all sides of the story, it's a fundamental part of the job. It will make your journalism better. If someone comes to you and say, look, there is no evidence that this Horizon IT system is shonky. And all the people who have been prosecuted through the entirely independent criminal justice system. And all of them have ended up with, well, at that time, all the people we were talking about had ended up with criminal convictions. So that's a strong message. And whether or not that was entirely what was going on behind the scenes, and whether or not the people who were telling us that knew what was going on behind the scenes, which was one of the excuses that was given to the High Court after the panorama, it is another matter entirely. But yes, I would say to PR professionals, have your relationships in place before the crisis hits. Make sure you go out of your way to find out who is the expert in a particular field. Find out whether or not they are likely to write highly critical, inaccurate pieces that need correcting, because you can undermine their credibility if they're not doing their job properly. Or find out whether they're reasonable people and just set up a professional relationship with them. I'd like to think that she emailed me first thing this morning, the press officer that I told I didn't think was telling the truth on Saturday, and she emailed me this morning to give me some more information about what was happening with the scandal. And we kept that cordial relationship because I think it's mutually beneficial. I am putting her side, or the Post Office's side, out into the Twitter sphere as much as I'm putting the critics' side out. And I am getting hard information from her often before any other journalist. So those relationships, I would say, are absolutely essential. And it's a real shame, and this happened way before the pandemic, that journalism is so starved of time and resources. The ability to take a journalist out and spend some time with them over lunch when they're working on the deadlines that they're working to. I mean, Charlotte, you must have experienced this even at a well-resourced organization like ITV News. You are on the grind, you are on shift to get a program out. And relationship building, unfortunately, doesn't happen in the way that it used to when I started in journalism back in the early 2000s. And that's a real shame, because if you develop a human relationship with someone, I'm not saying that any PR or comms person would seek to exploit it, but when there is a crisis, you've got the mobile phone numbers, you know who the key players are, and you can have the conversation to get your key message to them, which they then have the option of doing whatever they want with. But at least you're not working from a standing start, which I sometimes see with organizations in crisis. You think you're telling the wrong people. You really are.
Well, I know that you've had, the impact that it's had on the victims. We can't sort of explain just how much it has devastated people's lives. I just wondered briefly the impact that it's had on you as a journalist covering those stories over those years.
Well, I've always said it's the greatest privilege of my life to be able to report this. I have got to know Seema and Devinder very well. Seema came out of prison, and I actually interviewed her in prison, which the BBC said that we couldn't use. But that was my first ever contact with her, when she was pregnant and chained to her hospital bed when she went for appointments, all the while articulately telling me that she did not commit this crime. And I remember one of the biggest turning points for me, because I was, as I say, working in BBC local radio. And when you're doing a breakfast show, you think that when you come off air at 9 o'clock, you're going to spend the afternoon writing that novel. When you do a breakfast show, your days are just spent in a sort of haze of sleep deprivation and pain. So the ability that I had to try and push this story was limited. But I remember getting an email from a chap the day before he was due to go to court to plead guilty. And this was after we'd done our investigation. And I wasn't able to reach him in time to suggest that he might want to speak to his legal counsel about whether that was a good idea. And I realized that if I didn't try and push this story forward, then this was just going to keep happening. And I had to try and do whatever I could to make some noise about it. And I got very lucky, actually. I mean, I do a lot of corporate work, and I enjoy doing the corporate work because I love going inside a building when people aren't being defensive, and you learn things about the individuals and the industry and develop relationships on the other side of the fence, which have become invaluable to me in terms of informing how I report my day-to-day work as a journalist. And it's been really useful to have that understanding of what makes a corporate tick, so that when it comes to saying, okay, well, this is something that needs someone looking at this entirely. And I mean, as a sort of side example, I left BBC Surrey and got a job at Channel 5 presenting one of their Alan Partridge used to call them the Crash Bang Wallop series of look at this idiot television. It was called Criminals Caught on Camera. But people say, well, why are you doing that if you want to be a serious journalist? And I was like, well, A, any port in a storm, B, it's quite good money, C, it's quite good profile. But what it allowed me to do was spend the time that I was not filming this series working on for free, working on this post office investigation and sort of sending out little drippy blogs about this in the hope that people would pick up on it. So as a journalist, I do think that there's a way of approaching story which doesn't necessarily need you to be working for the Sunday Times investigative unit or one of the new organizations, the Bureau of Investigative Journalism, or demanding time off from the newsroom. You can approach a story, if it's a big enough or a good enough story, a number of different ways. And I've been through phases like crowdfunding and the like, and it's a very weird place to be as a journalist at the moment. But there is a way through, particularly if you've got a story that you think is bigger than is being given enough attention to at any given time. And I was joking just before we came on. Now this story has actually absolutely gone everywhere, and I'm trying to launch a book on an entirely different subject, and no one wants to talk to me about that.
Let's move on to that, because I'm conscious of time. And if you have any questions, do put them into the chat box at the bottom. But it might seem that these two stories are so different, but what parallels can you see from reporting on the Heard and Depp trials?
I suppose the way that they affect people in such a big way, the emotions around Johnny Depp and Amber Heard aren't just limited to their fan base. They tap right into the culture war about believing narratives, how the court systems can be potentially weaponized in the ongoing endless gender war, and how some legal processes may be geared towards one side more than another, and imbalance of or inequality of arms. Sorry, I do talk to a barrister who used to be in the military a lot, and he keeps using these military phrases, but the term inequality of arms was one that came up in the Bates v Post Office litigation. Johnny Depp had an inequality of arms against Amber Heard. Initially, he would say that because she made these allegations in a court through the court processes, that he was at a disadvantage, but he was able to manipulate public opinion and use all the tools at his disposal, his fame and his wealth, to turn the corner on that. And it was fascinating to me that the post office story was largely achieved through a campaigner called Alan Bates, the head of the Justice for Sub-Postmasters Alliance, who doesn't really like the media much. He gets things done through the courts. And I used to have arguments with him saying, look, you can't just focus on the narrow confines of the law. You need to tell the public, you need to bring public outrage along with you, so that you've got the pressure on the politicians to do something about this. It's no coincidence that the Secretary of State and the chair of the Business Select Committee have both ordered investigations into what broke on Friday. It's due to the amount of public affairs and media pressure on them to make a decision and be seen to be making a decision. And for too long, that didn't happen in the post office story. In the Johnny Depp story, they were well aware how useful public opinion and the shifting tide of public opinion would be when it came to getting the decision in the courts that they wanted. Because whether you like it or not, in this country and America, you can be sure that jurors and judges look at what's happening in the wider world. And if the wider world is sending the messages that they think they need to be taking an interest in, they will.
And was there a difference between how the two different teams communicated with you?
Yeah, there was very, and it's always been quite an interesting dynamic. I mean, when I was sitting in court in 2020, waiting for the first day of the trial to start, I got a tap on the shoulder from a smartly dressed lady who handed me her card and said, "Oh, hi, I'm doing Amber Heard's PR. I'm here for any information that you might need." Now, that doesn't normally happen. And I immediately tweeted it, which caused a little bit of a kerfuffle at the PR firm, because they weren't expecting that kind of information to go public. And I thought, well, this is interesting. This is part of the circus that surrounds a case like this. Out in Virginia last year, Amber Heard's team were extremely defensive, and I actually got an invitation to sit down with their head of PR so that they could discuss my journalism with me, which again, as I'm very happy to talk to anyone about anything, I said, yeah, you're more than welcome to sit me down and talk to me about the quality of my journalism. Whereas Johnny Depp's team were very much, oh, hi, Nick, yeah, let me take your mobile number, here's my mobile number, and they were willing to give you the information that they wanted to give you, not the information I necessarily was looking for, but they were willing to talk to you at 10 o'clock at night whilst, I phoned one of them up while she obviously seemed to be at some kind of party and said, look, I need to know this. And she was very helpful. She was, and this kind of ready availability of that side's PR, obviously I was trying to be as objective and as clear as possible in the way that I wrote up everything that came my way. But I would say this, people who are at the top of their game aren't just incredibly professional, they also tend to be nice people as well. And I got the feeling that Johnny Depp could afford the people who were at the absolute top of their game, who could do the job and weren't snotty at the same time. They were friendly and helpful. And you knew you were being spun a line. I mean, that's the job of a journalist, to see through that. But again, that kind of approach, it has an effect. It has an effect on everyone around you. It's nice to be nice sometimes,
I think I can honestly say I would never advocate for anyone to sit a journalist down and tell them how to do their job. I think that is probably, crisis PR 101 not to do.
And I remember, Nick, you were mentioning about just how Johnny Depp's team were in terms of just not perhaps sort of controlling the information, but they would sort of feed you little bits like Haribo's, for example. Tell us about that.
Yeah, the lawyers for Johnny Depp's team, again, seem to be that top drawer bunch, not only brilliant in court, but friendly and approachable out of court, whereas Amber Heard's lawyers were obviously came off second best in the trial in Virginia. Different set of circumstances in the UK. But in Virginia, they were very much, I can't talk to you. And they'd walk down the corridor and they'd ignore even your attempts to make a polite conversation with them, which, they knew that we were trying to tap them up for information. They knew we weren't there just to sort of make friends. But yeah, standing next to Ben Chu, who was the senior lawyer in the canteen, he showed me a packet of Haribo and said, oh, don't tell anyone, but this is our secret weapon. That kind of little aside or detail, which I, didn't put in any journalism because I thought, I know what's going on here. I'm just going to play it straight. But by the same token, you warm towards them, and you can have that maybe have another more important conversation with them because you kind of broken the ice. And I think that was telling about the way that and whether it was because Johnny Depp can afford the very best people in the planet when it comes to his PR and when it comes to his legal team, or whether they were a reflection of his character and intentions, and in the same way Amber Heard's team were a reflection of her character and intentions, or just her lack of resources, I don't know. And it's your job as PR professionals to make journalists happy with the service that they're getting. It's our job to be deeply suspicious of that service at all times. That's I think the sort of dividing line. But that doesn't mean that you can't have good and productive working relationships with highly professional comms people.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting because there's a parallel in so many crises that the people who you would think are responsible for answering the question, run and hide or hide behind kind of a legal response, or don't answer a question at all, when actually it might be much more disarming, to just sit down and answer a few questions and give you some of that sense of where things are going, so that you as a journalist do your job and they can get on and do their job. It's so often in a crisis that we just see people run and hide, and it leaves this kind of vacuum, doesn't it, in which you're always going to, it's just human nature to think that something else is going on.
Yeah, and obviously you shouldn't ever tell a journalist anything that you wouldn't want to see in print, but that doesn't mean that if you have a relationship with a journalist, you can't agree the parameters under which you're giving them information. And if that journalist is professional, then they should respect that. And you can You can say things on background, you can say things which are quotes but which are unattributable, and those are the sort of two off the record, or you can go on the record and you can give your name if you're confident about it. And that's something that you need to sort out between yourselves before you start talking to journalists. But it doesn't mean there aren't ways of saying to someone off the record, look, I will get you this information as soon as it comes to me, but I can't give you anything now. But bear with me, as far as I'm aware, this isn't right. And I will be able to prove to you that this isn't right very, very soon. What's your deadline? How are you thinking that you're going to characterize it going forward? You can have those conversations. And I appreciate journalists are, you get campaigning journalists, you get suspicious journalists, you get unprofessional journalists, you get some who might be easily manipulated. And so, we're all of a different stripe. We've all got different demands in terms of our publications and what we're intending to do. But if you have those relationships in place before the crisis starts, then you're much more likely to know what you're dealing with, and therefore able to start that flow of information into the public sphere.
I was going to say it's know your journalist, isn't it? Because there's a very difference between dealing with a campaigning journalist versus, a journalist that's perhaps never covered the story before. You need to know the parameters.
Yeah, and campaigners, not just campaigning journalists, campaigners can call themselves journalists, and they have, obviously, everyone's got the ability to publish anything they like. So again, it is, and I appreciate how difficult that is, because sometimes I, as a freelancer, phone up the news desk and it's a voice that I've never heard. Then a week later, it's another voice that I've never heard. So even internally, we know there's a lot of churn within journalism. So you could cultivate a contact for 2 or 3 years, and just as they're becoming useful, they go and get a job in corporate comms with your rival. And you think, oh well, that's great, but it is all down to human relationships and professionalism on both sides. I mean, I think I've come to appreciate that. When you start off as a journalist, you think you're going to change the world, and you think you're going to be lobbing rocks at organizations who have done bad things. But the more you learn about life, and the more you learn about the way that the corporate world works, you always see that there are other sides to the story and ways of telling them which don't impugn your integrity or your publication's integrity, still get the story across, but it's fundamentally fair. And that's what I've always tried to be with my journalism, is just fundamentally fair in what I'm reporting to everyone, respecting that sometimes there is a massive inequality of arms between a well-resourced corporate tooled up to the teeth with lawyers and comms professionals, and a bewildered victim who may not have much time left on this earth.
Well, I'm conscious of time, so I think that we should take a couple of questions. You've got some very flattering comments as well, Nick, for praising you for your work, which is we wholeheartedly agree with. Someone asking if there's going to be a screenplay.
Oh, well, there is an ITV drama, which I think starts shooting next week. I don't think I'm able to tell you who's in it, but the star is a household name. It's going to be run across 4 parts in the early part of next year. And we're hoping to get, I'm a consultant to the drama, and we're hoping to get 8 million eyeballs a night. Now, if we think that the story is starting to finally find its place in the public sphere, I would imagine that after that TV series goes out, and I've been working with the guys for 2 years now, and they are utterly committed to telling the story properly without any fanfare or distortion. And I think that will really start to ram home just what the Post Office has been doing over the last 20 years. So yes, is the short answer. There is a screenplay, it's been written, and it's starting filming next week.
Oh, that's good. That's good to hear. Brian Rogers has also asked, I suppose, the biggest question of all, really, which is whether you think we will ever see anyone senior from the Post Office being sacked. I know Marina Hyde wrote a particularly angry article several days ago, just the fact that, in her opinion, no one has ever been held to account over this. Do you think that could change in the future?
Well, I would be very surprised if Nick Reed's job was not hanging by a thread right now, just in terms of the development that happened on Friday. You do not make up a metric which involves the independent chair of a retired judge from a statutory inquiry into how bad your organisation has been performing, stick it in an annual report, award yourself a bonus on the back of it, and then lay it before Parliament. I mean, that is, well, if there were more public pressure or more public awareness of this story, I'm not necessarily sure he would be in a job this time next week. I think now, with the announcement of the internal inquiry ordered by the Secretary of State and the Business Committee inquiry, that he may be okay for now. but they have still misled Parliament, which is potentially, in the context of an annual report, false accounting and therefore a criminal offence. However, if you look at all scandals in public life, and this goes back to the infected blood inquiry, Hillsborough, Grenfell, Windrush, how many people, banking crisis, how many people have been successfully criminally prosecuted as a result of events which have destroyed lives over a long period of time, characterized by denial and cover up. And when it actually all comes out in the wash, the people responsible tend to get away with it. So the short answer, no, I don't think anyone is really going to be finding themselves, as the sub-postmasters were, in a criminal court trying to defend themselves. You may get some censure in the final report from the statutory inquiry when it comes out, hopefully next year.
And we've also got a question particularly about Paula Venables. Someone saying that when they met her, she came across as humble and sort of remorseful in private. What's your view of her today after everything that's happened?
Well, I would describe her public position and possibly even private position, although I've only met her once, as pious rather than humble. She basically delegated her leadership of this scandal to people who were not capable of giving the right answers and being truthful. She ignored it. Her job when she was appointed was to make the Post Office wash its face, which is what she managed to make it do, whilst essentially pretending that the Horizon scandal wasn't an issue. And she left in 2019 with a CBE and a place on the board of the Cabinet Office, which she was quickly stripped of by the incoming Postal Affairs Minister in the Lords when the scale of the scandal became apparent. But the government was supporting her all the way. They were endorsing the legal action and the defence of the legal action against them at the High Court. They were rewarding her with gongs. They were rewarding her with a seat at the table of the great and good. And they got that entirely wrong. And I suspect she spent, since she's withdrawn from public life, a lot of time reflecting on her position. But the most recent thing that we heard from her back in 2020 was a letter whereby she pointed the finger at her IT suppliers and she pointed her finger at the lawyers and said, I did nothing wrong. I was acting on advice from the lawyers and the assurances that I was given by the IT people. I don't think, whatever she says, her actions have demonstrated any contrition for the victims of this scandal, who, by ignoring them for such a long period of time, prolonged their delay of access to justice, which is, again, an offence under the Human Rights Act. And
another question's just come in. If you said that the Post Office haven't given you an interview, if they did, what would be your first question to them?
I think that brilliant question that was given to Liz Truss by the first local radio presenter up in BBC Leeds when she did that infamous round of local radio. And the very first question, which of course the national media were all dialing into, the presenter just said, what were you thinking? I would like to know what Nick Reed was thinking by signing off a bonus metric relating to the Post Office's performance at a public inquiry, whilst trying to minimise the compensation for its victims, and then just essentially making up information, which it then slotted into its annual report. I mean, there's a great quote from Lord Arbuthnot, who has been a staunch defender of the sub-postmasters since 2010. And he just said in the FT this morning, it does appear that nobody on the board of directors read the accounts. If that's the level of competence or energy they put into their roles, then they really ought to go. And I think, yeah, I'd sit him down and I'd say, come on, what were you thinking? You can't, he's a sort of jolly good chap sort is Nick Reed, and he does that sort of jolly good chap act. I'm the new broom and I'm going to do the moral right thing by the victims in the Post Office. And this has just shown it up for what it is, just words.
I think we've got time for one final question because we've got a couple of minutes left. Do you think there's a difference then between the issues with sort of leadership of individuals, or is this a sort of group issue?
Well, I can imagine that turning around a corporate supertanker is a very, very difficult job. And that's what the Post Office is. It was sailing off in completely the wrong direction, and it was about to hit it probably did hit the iceberg of this scandal. Nick Reed comes on board, he brings in a senior leadership team, but you are dealing with a workforce who largely believe that the postmasters are still chancing their arm and got away with it on technicality. And I've heard that twice from two people from inside the organisation. So he's got to get his own ship in order first before anything is going to go right, because he's still heading off in the wrong direction. He's not in charge of his vehicle. So, I mean, I've never been in management. I've never been. I cannot imagine how difficult that is when you've got to try and get 5, 10, 20,000 staff, utterly believing that you have catastrophically messed up, and that some people within the organisation might be responsible for that, and that they are going to get in trouble for it. But in order to change, in order to survive, you've got to do the right thing. So that is the scale of the challenge facing that organisation, which they built up for themselves through denial, through not listening to the right information over a period of decades, or a period. I mean, if you read my book, you look at the history of this scandal, goes right back to the Victorian era, and the cultural assumptions that the Post Office made about its sub-postmasters largely being untrustworthy. But yeah, it's a big deal, and unfortunately, what has happened over the last week or so has shown that the Post Office still does not get it. And if that is still happening 2 decades into a scandal, if anyone is saying that about your business, then, you know, on a personal level, I'd get out of that business as soon as you possibly can, because it isn't going to learn, and it's going to hit the rocks soon.
And Barnaby, a sort of final thought from you at all?
I think just listening to Nick there, we see it so often in a crisis. You've got to think about, you know, are you defending the individuals, or are you defending an organisation, right? And you have to think about what it is you are working towards, reputation-wise. That's really important to really focus on, because those two things might not always be the same thing. So yeah, really interesting perspective there, Nick. Thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for having me on. It's been a privilege.
No, well, thank you. We have run out of time. It has flown by, which we always knew it would do. So thanks to our guest, Nick, for joining us. We look forward to hearing more about the screenplay when that actually comes out, and best of luck with your book when it's published next week. But for now, from Nick and from Barnaby and from me, thank you to all of you for joining. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Charlotte. Thanks, guys.